right, so as we move into Unit 1, the foundations of American government, we're going to have to begin at the beginning, obviously. We're going to have to begin with independence because the founding of our nation is going to significantly impact the type of government that is created. And so while I'm not going to go too in-depth on the push for independence, the Revolutionary War, I'm going to hit the high points and sort of move on to the founding documents because our beliefs that are formulated as a result of the push for independence are going to be a significant impactor on how we create our founding documents and the government that we do put into place. So our course learning objectives are to identify the origins of the core values in American political thought, including ideas regarding representational government, and summarize Great Britain's actions leading to the the American Revolution. And our departmental learning objective is to explain the origin and development of the constitutional democracy in the United States. And so hopefully at the end of the lecture you can answer these questions. What are the origins of American political thought, and what actions led colonists to revolt? So if we start dealing with the Constitution here in the beginning, there are a couple of things that is worth noting about our Constitution. Our Constitution is the oldest, shortest written Constitution still in use in modern day. It has lasted 230 plus years with relatively few changes, but it is a living document, and so we are able to change it and reinterpret it as we face new things moving into the future. And so it has really proven the test of time and withstood the test of time. And it is relatively short, especially when you compare it to some of the state constitutions. The Texas state constitution is very long and in-depth and explains things in minutia. But the American Constitution is relatively brief. It is a compilation of American and British political thought as a guide or blueprint for the future. And so we obviously come from Britain. We were colonies of Britain. And so as we began creating our government and our framework of government, we drew upon our British history and incorporated a lot of British political thought and British customs and ways of doing things into the Constitution. But many of the British political thinkers that we borrowed from have really, over time, sort of become very associated with American-style democracy. And so we're going to see a mix, a compilation of a bunch of different things that brings us into the Constitution as we know it. We often sort of lump the Founding Fathers together as one big group of individuals who thought the same way. And this is not always true. This is not true at all. In fact, our Founding Fathers were not a group of like-minded individuals. They all had the same goal in mind, which was to create a lasting government that would be successful and be effective, but they were not a like-minded group. They didn't believe in getting to that end result in the same way. And they're going to come together to create our Constitution because it's necessary. We have a Constitution in place that was not working. And this Constitution was called the Articles of Confederation. And we'll get into the Articles of Confederation more in depth later on in the lecture, but the Articles of Confederation were very ineffective, and so there's going to be a necessity. And out of this necessity, our new Constitution will blossom. And as you'll see as we start talking about the different elements of our Constitution, the American Constitution was brought together largely by compromise. So it wasn't just a whole bunch of individuals thinking the same way, writing their things down. There was significant compromise that had to occur in order to piece together the document that we have today and that we know today. The ideas such as liberty and self-government that are seen as, quote, American in modern day are actually very European ideas. They are going to come from European philosophers, namely British philosophers. So it's interesting that we're going to end up fighting a war against the British to remove them from our affairs and to become our own nation, but we're going to draw upon largely British European ideas to develop our Constitution and a lot of the principles that it is founded upon. And so a lot of these ideas are going to emerge earlier in Europe. And we're going to look at these in just a moment, but they're going to emerge earlier in Europe. And instead of a following of new ideas, as is often thought, actually the ideas in the American Constitution are actually very, very old. And these old ideas are going to lead the colonists to actually revolt. So sometimes we have this very romantic view in our minds that sort of give us an imagery of the founding fathers coming together and putting forth some very new ideas that govern our nation even in modern day. But if we look at it, they're borrowing a lot of these ideas from philosophers that lived, 100 years earlier. And so these ideas aren't new. While the founding fathers were some very, very smart individuals, they didn't just come up with these things by divine intervention or, on the spur of the moment. They're going to be borrowing from things that happened or were developed a long time ago. So, continuing on, if we look at these ideas, political thought in the American Constitution, we can really begin with John Locke. And if we can recall, John Locke is a 17th century English political philosopher. And he is the most significant philosopher of influence in American beliefs. And we're going to borrow very heavily from John Locke's ideas as we create our founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, as well as the Constitution. John Locke is going to formulate the ideas on a relationship between the government and the people. And he says that people have natural rights, and natural rights are things like life, liberty, and property. And the role of government is to ensure that these ideas are protected. And so he says we enter into a social contract with a government to protect these rights. He says that a social contract is a belief regarding the origins and purpose of government. Governments just don't happen. They're man-made. They're created. And they have a significant purpose. And the purpose in regards to a government are going to really contrast the idea of the divine right monarchy, which had been very common in history and in Great Britain. This monarchy that was put on earth by God to rule in God's stead was the prevailing thought over much of history. And the social contract is going to deviate from this thought. And it's the idea that humans were the creators of government, not God. And they were made out of necessity. They're going to be made because people need to be protected. Their inalienable or natural rights are going to need to be protected. And so people are going to enter into an agreement or a contract with a man-made government, and they will sacrifice a portion of their freedoms, and they will give the government the consent to rule over them as long as the government will protect their lives, liberties, and properties. And so there's an exchange going on. The people will live in a society that is ruled by a government that they have created as long as the government comes together and provides protection for these individuals. But if the government broke the contract, the people were no longer bound by the terms of the contract, and they could formulate a new government. And so John Locke's ideas were really a departure from that divine right theory of monarchy that stated pretty much that if you disagreed with the government, you're disagreeing with God, and really starts to turn the tide towards government being a man-made thing, and if it's not serving man's needs like it's supposed to, then man can create a new one. And so these are John Locke's ideas, but they're going to be a lot of ideas that we are going to draw from. I say we, the economists are going to draw from as they begin formulating their own new government. Another thing that Americans draw from is the Magna Carta, which is a British document, the Great Charter, signed by King John in 1215. This is an earlier document that outlined the rights of British citizens. And it outlined the British citizens' rights to have their life, liberty, and property protected. And like I said, it's going to be signed by King John in 1215. And it's essentially a promise from the monarchy that, or promise from the monarchy to the subjects that the monarchy would refrain from harmful actions of the people of England. And so it's a significant limiter of the king or the monarchy to abuse the rights of individuals. And it's going to be signed very early on. King John is going to be forced by his subjects to sign this document in 1215. And so Great Britain starts out as an absolute monarchy, and if you look at it today, it's a constitutional monarchy with a very weak monarchy. And if you look at British history, there's not one single revolution that occurs that creates this very constitutional style of government. It's going to be a slow progression over time of them going from a direct divine right monarchy to a more democratic style. And there's going to be some high points of evolution during their time, and the Magna Carta is going to be one of these high points. It is going to be one of these times that the government starts to be less of a centralized dictatorship style of government with a divine right to citizens' rights and more democratic style. And so it is going to have some prominent provisions that protect the life of individuals, the property of individuals, as well as the liberties, the freedoms, the things that people should enjoy within society. And so it's going to put things into effect like no free man shall be taken in prison or in any way destroyed, except by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. And what this really does is going to lay the foundation for the Fifth and Sixth Amendments that we are going to put into place whenever we create our own Constitution. So there again, we can see how we are borrowing from British political history as we formulated our American Constitution. Another one of these high points in the evolution of English politics from a divine right monarchy to a more democratic style is going to be the English Bill of Rights, which was passed in 1689. And a Bill of Rights, and you probably know this by now, but a Bill of Rights, we're familiar with our Bill of Rights, but it is a list of liberties and protections possessed by a nation's citizens. So if you are a citizen of a nation, the items within a Bill of Rights are protected for you. And the English Bill of Rights heavily influences John Locke's ideas, and thereby will heavily influence the American ideals. But it will enumerate the rights of citizens. It's going to spell them out and tell some significant rights of citizens. And there again, it will explicitly guarantee things like rights to life, liberty, and property. And so there cannot be any arbitrary infringement upon your life, and infringement upon your liberty, and infringement upon your property without due process. And so the English Bill of Rights is going to profoundly influence the United States Constitution and the United States Bill of Rights. And so another thing that plays into our American Constitution is this idea of self-government. And self-government is a core tenet of American political thought. It's rooted in a variety of traditions. And so it's not just going to come from one specific tradition, but it is going to be derived from a variety. First of all, a limited self-government was allowed by the British. So laws are going to be made by Parliament, and property-owning males are allowed to vote for representatives to Parliament. And so there is in British law and British history this evolution to a more democratic style government, and they are going to allow limited self-government for British citizens. And so Parliament will pass laws, but Parliament will be voted upon by property-owning males, the citizens. And America was very accustomed to the idea of self-government because, by and large, American colonists, these colonists, had a very deep history of governing themselves. They were very far removed from the British Crown, and so, you know, this is in a time before email and phone lines and things like that. And so it takes a very long time for information to get back and forth. And so the Americans are going to have to engage in a significant amount of self-government and self-reliance in order to survive in the colonies. And this is going to manifest in a number of ways. In 1619, Virginia is going to establish the first self-governing body, and it's going to establish what is called the House of Burgesses. And if we look at the Mayflower that comes over in the 1620s, they are going to sign an agreement called the Mayflower Compact, which essentially allows, it's an agreement by everybody on the Mayflower that they will govern themselves according to the laws made by the male voters of the colony. So they are essentially creating their own type of legislative body made up of the male citizens or the male voters within the colony, and they agree to be governed by these things. And so by the 18th century, all colonies had created legislatures to which men were elected to make the laws for their fellow colonists. So every colony had created some sort of a legislature. And so men are going to be elected, they will make laws, and so they have this degree of self-government. And so when colonists felt that this long-standing tradition of self-government was threatened by actions of Parliament and the king, this is when they're going to begin to revolt. And this is going to lead us into the American Revolution. Okay, so the American Revolution. Prior to 1763, the American colonies, or the British colonies really, had been ruled by Britain for over a century. And the colonists were used to being treated with what we we refer to as benign neglect, which means that they were left to their own devices. So benign meaning a term meaning that's, you know, not harmful, but neglect is being left alone or not really being infringed upon by the British. So the British were just sort of letting the colonists do their own thing, leaving them to their own devices. As long as the colonies kept paying the British taxes, they were not too concerned, and the British taxes were relatively low. And property ownership in the colonies was relatively high, and people readily proclaimed their allegiance to Britain. They didn't want to separate from Great Britain. There was no real movement in this direction prior to 1763. So what's going to happen? Well, the American Revolution really has its origins in the 7 Years' War, which was a war between Britain and France for control of the North American continent. And the outcome of the war is going to demonstrate that the British are going to gain control of most of French territory in North America. So the British are going to emerge as victorious. They're going to claim much of the French territory in the northern North American continent, and the British are going to be pretty supreme. And the colonists were happy to fight on behalf of Britain, because they hoped that at the end of the war they would be able to settle land west of the Appalachian Mountains that would be taken away from France. And so they thought, you know, we'll fight. This will be for our benefit. We'll be able to settle this land that previously we didn't have access to. And so they were very happy to fight. Remember, they didn't want to be separated from Great Britain. They were on the side of Great Britain. Following the war, Parliament is going to pass what is known as the Proclamation of 1763. And they do this in order to prevent a conflict with the native groups that are living in areas west of the Appalachian. So what this proclamation does is it prohibits colonists from purchasing land west of the Appalachians. Now remember, the whole goal behind assisting in the 7 Years' War was to be able to settle that that land west of the Appalachian Mountains, and now they're being told that they can't. And as a matter of fact, the 7 Years' War is going to be extremely expensive to the British, and so they are going to decide that if we're going to leave troops in the Americas to maintain the safety of the American colonists or the British colonists, then we're going to have to find a method of paying for this. And so they're going to institute some new taxes. And so for the first time, we're going to see what is known as direct taxation on the people. Typically, taxation is going to occur on transactions performed. And so when a transaction occurs between one individual and another, then it will be taxed. But now the British are trying to find a method to pay for the costly war and for the troops living in the colonies, and so they're going to institute some direct taxes. Colonists had not consented to direct taxation, and so they argued that it reduced their status as free men. They felt like their freedom was being infringed upon by the Parliament because they were being taxed, and it wasn't something that they had engaged in debate about. It wasn't something that they had a choice about. They had never given their consent to Parliament to be taxed, and so they felt like they were being infringed upon. Their rights, their freedoms were being infringed upon by these direct taxes. And the right to consent, they felt like the right to consent to taxation should be extended to them because in the Magna Carta and in the English Bill of Rights, this is something that is protected. It is enshrined in both of those documents that if there is going to be a taxation, then those being taxed should have some sort of a consent. Taxes were being imposed by the House of Commons, which is the legislative body in Great Britain, and the American colonists were not allowed to elect members to that legislative body. And so essentially, taxation is going to be administered upon these American colonists by a group of people they had not voted for. And so what they do is they say, this is a denial of our rights. You're infringing upon our freedom as citizens of Great Britain, and you are infringing upon some of these rights that are enshrined in very significant documents like the Magna Carta and the English Bill of Rights that have been in place since 1215 and 1689 or whatever. And so there's going to be some significant blowback from the colonists regarding this taxation, regarding the fact that they are not going to be allowed to settle land west of the Appalachian Mountains. And so a number of different acts are going to be established. One of the acts that is going to be established is the Stamp Act in 1765. And it's going to require that almost all paper goods have revenue stamps placed upon them. And so this is going to be a way to gain significant income on the part of the British Parliament. Paper goods, newspapers, cards, anything paper had to have a stamp of revenue. There's going to be significant outcry, and the British are going to quickly withdraw this act. They're going to see that it is wildly unpopular, and so they withdraw it. But they follow it up in 1767 by the Townshend Acts. And the Townshend Acts are going to tax some significant everyday items that are utilized in the colonies, things like glass and tea and paint. And this is going to cause a lot of strife as well. The Massachusetts legislature is going to be a significant player in this fight between the British and the American colonists, or the British colonists, and the legislature will issue a petition to the king that calls for a boycott of British goods. And so they're going to say, fine, if you're going to tax these everyday items, we're just simply not going to purchase them, thereby circumventing the taxes that you have placed upon them. This is going to anger the British, obviously, and so British officials are going to threaten to suspend the legislatures of colonies that engage in the boycott. So the British say, fine, if you decide to engage in this boycott and you're engaging in a legislative body that is self-governing, we're going to suspend those, and you're no longer going to be able to have that benign neglect that you have enjoyed for so long and allowed to sort of self-govern yourselves in a manner that you're used to. And so they're going to back this up by sending a warship to Boston in 1768. Well, on March 5th, 1770, this skirmish continues to build, and there's going to be an eruption of very hot heads that occurs outside the Massachusetts or the Boston Customs House. And so there's going to be some shots fired. Soldiers fired into a crowd of people that had amassed. Several people are going to hit. 3 people are going to die. And this is going to become known as that famous Boston Massacre. It's going to be sort of that first shot that is heard around the world that really touches off the American Revolution. Now, the British East India Company is going to be granted a monopoly on tea. And so essentially, to supply tea, which is a significant product that the British people use every day, to supply tea to the colonies, it has to be from the British East India Company, which is a British company. And so it's going to create a situation where individuals are going to have to end up paying those taxes. And so to sort of circumvent this boycott that has been instituted, a monopoly is going to be placed on distribution of tea. The colonial merchants are going to resent this because it's going to cut into their profits. There's not going to be any competition going on, and so they're going to have to pay a certain amount, even if it's too expensive. And so in response, as protest, Bostonians are going to board ships in the Boston Harbor, and they're going to throw its cargo of tea overboard in opposition. I'm not really sure what this was supposed to do or solve or what, but it obviously is going to demonstrate that the colonists are not happy. And so this is going to become known as the Boston Tea Party in 1773. And so we need to take a look at the First Continental Congress because of all of these things that have been boiling since 1763 and the 7 Years' War and all these acts and this essentially pissing match between the American colonists and the British government that has been going on for a while, this tit for tat back and forth, there's going to be a Continental Congress that is called. And the First Continental Congress is going to form in 1774 in response to what is known as the Coercive Acts. And the Coercive Acts are going to be passed by Parliament for just that reason. They're going to coerce the colonists into getting back in line, and they're going to punish them for their resistance. It's going to eliminate town meetings in Massachusetts, which is going to interfere with the colony's ability to self-govern. And this is going to be a massive blow to the colonists, and it's going to be seen as an assault on Massachusetts. And so the other colonists are going to be righteously angry, and they're going to be enraged, and they're going to rally to the defense of Massachusetts, defending Massachusetts and saying that they should be allowed to self-govern, and they can't believe that these coercive acts have been passed and is limiting this self-government. And all colonies are going to come together as a result, save Georgia, and they're going to form the First Continental Congress and create a very unified position to Great Britain. And then the Second Continental Congress will meet in May of 1775, And by this time, war with Great Britain had already begun, and we've already seen the battles at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. So at the Second Continental Congress, what they are going to do is they are going to declare their causes of rebellion. They're going to draft what is called the Declaration of Cause, which explains colonies' reasons for rebelling against the British Crown. And so when we begin in 1763, or prior to 1763, we have a bunch of colonists who have no desire to separate from Great Britain. But between 1763 and 1775, there's going to be some significant events that occur that demonstrate that the colonists are ready to separate. And so on July 2nd, 1776, America does declare their independence from Britain, and 2 days later they begin signing the Declaration of Independence, which is the official proclamation of separation from the Crown. Now we know that the Declaration of Independence was written by Thomas Jefferson, and it laid out the reasons. It laid out reasons that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness was something that should be protected, and that there was the government that was supposed to protect these rights, and they didn't feel like these rights were being protected by the British Crown. And so according to John Locke, if your life, liberty, and property, or pursuit of happiness, are not being protected, then that social compact or contract is null and void, and it is the job of the individuals within society to create a new government that will protect those life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And so there is this line in the Declaration of Independence that says, whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute a new government. And that is the goal of the colonists in this Declaration of Independence. The king had denied colonists of their rights and had established an absolute tyranny over these states, quote. And it was not tyranny that they were used to, and it was not tyranny that they were going to accept. And so it's also going to spell out the ways in which the monarchy had abused their power and had failed in his duties to his subject. They had taxed the colonies without the consent of their elected representatives. There had been, taxation without representation, as we have always known since our early days. It interfered with trade when it allowed for a monopoly on tea distribution by the British East India Company. And so it's going to have a significant impact on the commerce within the colonies. And it is going to deny the right to a trial by jury, because when individuals within the colonies were brought up on charges, they were sent back to England to stand trial. And so they were not being prosecuted and judged by a group of individuals that were their peers. They were being prosecuted by individuals back home who were sympathetic to the crown. And so there was a significant bias here. And we also see that they were denied their right to self-government when Massachusetts was stripped of their ability to continue their legislature with the Coercive Acts. And so because of all of these reasons, the colonies are going to declare themselves independent from the British Crown. And so this is going to lead us to the creation of our first constitution, which will be known as the Articles of Confederation. It will lead us to becoming our own republic. And so when we come back in our next lecture, this is where we're going to pick up. And so hopefully after this lecture, you will be able to answer the essential questions. What are the origins of American political thought, and what actions led colonists to revolt? And so I will see you next time, and thanks for watching.